Welcome to the Stumble Across podcast. This is the podcast where I basically stumble across people online and invite them on for a chat, usually with me knowing very little about them, completely unprepared, completely unfiltered, and often leading to uncovering the best stories. Now, in today's episode, I stumble across Niall, who is originally from Scotland, but has lived all over the world. He moved to America for summer camp, which ended up being for 5 years. He's also lived in Australia, New Zealand, before currently settling in Vietnam. We speak about if there's any other places on this list that he would like to live, or if Vietnam is the place to settle. We also talk about what a day looks like living in Vietnam and how he started his own company, creating podcasts, whilst also getting into stand-up comedy in Vietnam. Don't forget, if you like the podcast, please do subscribe and, of course, leave a rating and review as well. So let's get into today's podcast and meet Niall.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's exciting to be on the Stumble Across podcast. A cool theme. So my name's Niall Mackay. I'm originally from Scotland, as most of your listeners can probably hear already, although I do get asked if I'm Irish, Canadian, French. Yeah, I've lived all over the world. So I moved to America to work in a summer camp for one summer, and that turned into 5 years. So I was in America for about 5 years. Then I moved to Australia for 1 year, and that turned into 4. Then I met my wife in Australia. She's American. We moved to New Zealand for 1 year, and that turned into 4. And then we went traveling around Southeast Asia, and we moved to Vietnam for 6 weeks. And it's nearly 7 years later, we're still here in Vietnam. So the longest place I've ever lived since I left Scotland nearly 20 years ago.
So you're very well traveled then, is the word.
Well lived, I like to put it. Like, I've lived in a lot of places. I have traveled, but I'm not like a traveler so much. Like, I'm a liver, which is just weird. It was never meant to be like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what made you kind of make that first journey, decide to, I mean, I guess your first thought was to move out of Scotland and live elsewhere. That was
the weather. Yeah, get away from the weather.
I suppose, yeah.
No, I mean, so what it was, the main thinking at the time was I was going from my third year of university into my fourth year, and everyone else in my class, I was studying sports science, and everyone else that was in my class, they had a sport, they not like high level, not like Olympic level, but they played for the local football team, or they played for a hockey team, or they were a referee, or they had something like, extracurricular. And I had nothing apart from like drinking beer and listening to music, which did not like fit into my degree at all. So I was like, I got to get some like extracurricular activities before I complete this degree. Otherwise I finish with a degree and then I've got nothing else. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, you probably heard of like the Camp America, the massive kind of, it's basically a recruitment agency that recruits young Europeans to go and work in summer camps all across America. So I went to a summer camp fair in Edinburgh. First camp I came across was called Camp Fuller. It was based in Rhode Island. And I loved it immediately. And I was like, I want to come here. And the guy was like, well, look, this is your first one. Go and look around the rest of the camps. And if you still want to come to this one, come back, which is really cool of him. So I went around, looked to the other camps that were there, talked to a few of them. None of them really rang a bell with me. None of them really interested me for different reasons. So I went back to him and I was like, yeah, I want to come to your camp. And so got hired as the soccer coach, which I'm a terrible football player. We'll go back to using the British term football. I'm a terrible football player. I play for fun. I have no coaching qualifications or badges. And what the soccer coach basically did was nothing, essentially. Like, the previous soccer coaches had just played card games with the kids. And I was the first one to come along and I actually made them play football. So, sorry, I'm going to keep jumping between football and soccer. I just can't help it. So I actually made them play football and played games with them and made it more interesting. So from there, I ended up going back every summer. I got hired to be like the director of the boys division for a couple of years by the end. So I was in the senior management team and just had an unbelievable time. I got sponsored to live there for about a year, which was amazing. I fell in love with America. I still love it, but it's really difficult to get a visa. So I applied to get a visa for there and didn't get it, which actually turned out to be like an absolute blessing in disguise, because that was 2007, and obviously we had the financial crisis in 2008. So if I had gotten that visa and taken the job that I'd been offered, I probably would have lost that job a year later, because it was with the YMCA, so it's almost like a not-for-profit. I would have been one of the first jobs to go after that financial crisis. And so, but yeah, so I didn't get the visa and I left to go to Australia. So my friend who had met at the summer camp, he was already there. He's like, well, come and meet me in Australia. I was like, all right, perfect. So again, go to Australia, get a year visa. Just have like Australia is just amazing. It's just unbelievable country. Like everything you hear about, especially for backpackers, you just have an unbelievable time. So went to Australia, went there for a year, ended up getting a second year visa, stayed for 4 years, had a job, and just absolutely loved it. I thought that's where my future would be.
Yeah.
And then just that job, I had to end up quitting that job. It was too, I got kind of burnt out from it, completely burnt out. And during that time, I'd met my now wife, who she was traveling as well. She's American. And I got a new job in Perth, Western Australia. So we moved cross country, went to
Mhm.
live in Perth, took a new job, and they completely missold me the job. It wasn't what I'd expected at all. So by the time I think it's 3 month probation came up, I was like, I'm gonna quit. Like I had to walk away from that job as well because I was like, I don't want to pass my probation because then I'm tied in for a year or two, and this is not
And
what
what
I'm.
was that? What was that? Was that like one of those camp jobs, or was it?
No, so I ended up working in face-to-face fundraising
Okay.
for some really major global charities like Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, and
Mhm.
I absolutely loved it. I did it for 4 years. It's a job I never thought I'd do. One of those guys on the street that's asking you to sign up for a monthly donation.
Mhm.
Even now it makes me kind of cringe to think about it, but I absolutely loved it. It's a great job.
Mhm.
I had friends that had done it and they convinced me it was a good job. When I got into it to raise money for charity, and I was able to raise millions and millions of dollars for the different charities that I worked for. So for me, the motivation every day was to go out and raise money for charity and some amazing organizations. So you kind of get over that cringe factor in the beginning because definitely like in the beginning you're like, what am I doing, this is
Mhm.
terrible. So the job I'd moved for, I'd been sold that I was going to be a trainer and going around and training people how to do it, but I ended up just doing the same job as I'd done before, being out on the street trying to sell people. And by that point yeah, like I said, I was just burnt out. I'd been doing it for 4 years. So at that point my wife and I were like, well, what do we do now? So we're like, all right, we're still under 30, we can get a year's visa for New Zealand.
Mhm.
So we went to New Zealand for a year and fell in love with New Zealand. So almost immediately applied for permanent residency and got that. So we now are permanent residents of New Zealand. And then during that time, we came to Vietnam for a holiday, fell in love with the place. Vietnam's like a magical place. And went back to New Zealand. We're like, right, let's save up for a year. We're going to do a big trip around Southeast Asia. Then we'll come back, get on with our life, blah, blah, blah. We did Thailand, Malaysia, and then 6 weeks in Vietnam. And as I said, 7 years later, we're still here and haven't left.
That's incredible. Like that's rarely people would even see half of those places. Never mind to live in all of those. And I kind of think what would have happened if you didn't make that first journey. Like you think you maybe just be stuck in Scotland and not know all these beautiful places. Not that Scotland isn't beautiful, but
Oh, that's a bit wet. Well, it's funny you mention that actually, because I was talking to my mum just last night, and I was feeling a bit guilty because I've been away now for 20 years, and obviously she's missed most of my adult life. I still talk to her all the time, and we're really close. That's never changed, but obviously I'm just not there. And
Mhm.
then so Mother's Day hits home a little bit as well. You're like, oh, I feel pretty bad that I'm not there for it. But without me even saying anything, she was like, "I'm so glad you left." She's like, "There's nothing here for you. If you'd
Mhm.
stayed, you would have some poxy job. You would never
Yeah.
met your wife, and my wife is amazing." She's like, "You would."
Mhm.
She loves her as well. So she's like, "You would never met Adri, and you'd be here and you'd be miserable." She's like, "I'm so glad you left." And I was like, "Oh my goodness, all right." That took a load off my mind because I literally before she said that, I was like, I feel really bad about
Mm.
essentially leaving her. But it
Yeah.
is cool
Yeah.
that I've not, yeah, like you said in the beginning, I'm not really a traveler. I've lived in places, so you really get a sense of the place. You understand the people, the culture, all those nuances that if you're just visiting, you're never going to get those little nuances. So that's always been really exciting.
And like particularly from the UK, I mean, it is those Camp America type things, or Australia. Those two places are very, very popular, and I'm sure you can explain why. I mean, do you think it is quite close to the UK?
No, it is close. I mean, they're all Western countries. The weather's different, and
Mm,
it's the accents are slightly different. But you're not going to the Middle East or anything like that. I
yeah,
mean, Vietnam here, this is wildly, shockingly different
right.
culturally, the language. But even then, you still get on with life. But
Mhm.
the UK and Australia and America, they're all they're all pretty similar, right? They're all just white Western countries. Obviously, not all white; they're very, very mixed. Especially America has a much more mixed population in terms of race than where I was from in the UK, which was just a very white background. So it was,
And
but so for me, it was just an eye opener to meet different people from different backgrounds, and just traveling. It's that cliche of like traveling broadens your horizons, but it literally like my mind went from being like this small to just being like, like
yeah,
whoa.
yeah, yeah. And did you get homesick at all, like during that first period, or were you just kind of just caught up in the whole living there, I suppose?
No, I don't think I've been asked this before. I don't think I've been homesick for a second in the last 20 years.
Right.
Never
Yeah.
missed it one bit. And
Mhm.
people ask why. I mean, the biggest thing, I joke about the weather, but the weather is really bad in Glasgow, particularly. You know, it's raining, it's wet, and it's sideways rain. You know,
Yeah.
I think about when I was in university and I wore baggy jeans, and your jeans get wet up to the knees, and
Yeah. I don't know.
it's just cold and miserable all the
Mhm,
time. So
mhm.
I love it here in Saigon. It's warm, 365 days a year. Um, I wear shorts year round. I'm a skinny little guy, so I get cold really easily. So I don't like cold weather like at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the weather was a big thing, and then as you know, being from Northern Ireland, there's so many racial tensions in Glasgow, in particular, with Catholics and Protestants, and I was part of that because I was brought up with that. You know, I was a Rangers fan, so I would sing horrible songs about Catholics, and even though my best friends were Catholics and my other friends were Celtic fans, like it was just
Mhm.
all nonsense. But
Yeah.
once I
Yeah.
traveled and I realized that, I was like, I don't want to be part of that. That's the whole
Mhm.
Rangers Celtic thing, the whole Protestant Catholic thing. It's absolutely ridiculous. And
Yeah.
so when you go back and you see it's still going on and it's all that's in the newspapers and it's all your friends still talk about, you're like, I'm so glad I left because this is not what I want my life to be about at
Do
all.
do you feel sorry for people who just never escape that, or just even not even just the whole religion thing, but just being stuck in the one place and they don't travel, they don't broaden their horizons, like the things that they're missing?
No, I don't feel sorry for them because everyone is happy with their own choices. I think like a lot of my
Mm.
best friends have never left and they're extremely happy. And I go through spells where I'm jealous of them because they've settled down with a car and a house and a mortgage and a holiday in Tenerife twice a year.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they've got that nice lifestyle where I'm living this nomadic. You know, I'm pretty settled here, obviously, been here for 7 years, but I'm still living the expat life. So it's always there's always a challenge to that. Like I don't own a house or a car. Part of that's because I've never really wanted to. But yeah, so I never ever feel sorry for them though, because I think everyone I know like that has made their own choices and they're happy with that.
Mhm, mhm. And how was the kind of settling in period for you when you finally? I mean, do you see Vietnam being the place that you stay now, or do you think there's another one on the list?
I don't think there's another one on the list. My wife and I have talked about this because you know we've been here for so long, we're so settled, and we're at that age. Like I'm 40 now. Uh,
Mhm,
the next place we'll move will be a forever place. I think we're both past that stage of going somewhere and trying it out.
mhm,
Because even here in Saigon, we probably had about 5 different phases in our Saigon existence from, you know, like you said, the settling in phase, this phase, that phase. Um, and I don't think we'd ever want to do that again. So if and when we do leave, and I do think we will leave at some point, we don't know when, but when that does come, it will probably be either the UK or sorry, not the sorry, never the UK, sorry, never the UK. It will be the US
mhm,
because my wife's from there, or back to New Zealand where we have permanent residence. But what the more we talk about it, every single place in the world has its pros and cons, right? So like Vietnam has a lot of cons. We don't speak the language still because it's really difficult. And but you can get by because lots of people speak English. But there's
mhm.
really bad pollution here. The trash is really bad, and so things like that. That's a massive con. Okay, New Zealand is like beautiful, clean, green, no pollution, but it's also on the other end of the world. It's far away. It's cold. Where we lived in Wellington anyway, the housing isn't up to scratch. It's expensive, so it's really difficult, you know. But I just know not the UK.
Yeah, yeah. And what does the typical day look like for you now then, being in Vietnam?
Well, so now I run my own company here, which is called 7 Million Bikes Podcasts, because
Mhm,
I lost my job that I had here during the pandemic. And I'd started making podcasts, well, a podcast as a hobby. And then that kind of grew and became really popular and quite well known. And just about to hit 50,000 downloads, which is just beyond my wildest dreams, as you probably know as well. In the beginning, you're refreshing the whole time, and you're
I
like,
know.
"Well, I went up by 2, it went up by 4. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness!"
yeah, yeah.
And you're just watching the numbers go up. So
Mhm.
um, from there, then I started a second podcast about. I'm also a stand-up comedian as well, which I got into here in Saigon. I'd never done anywhere else in the world, but something I'd wanted to do for years and years and years, and finally plucked up the courage to do it here. So now
Mhm.
I do stand-up comedy. So I combine my passions for comedy and podcasting, and started a podcast about comedy. So I ask comedians. Well, I get comedians on the show, and I play one of their jokes, and then I
Uh-huh.
ask them, "Did that really happen?" And then obviously the answer is yes or no. If the answer is yes, they explain what really happened and how they turned it into a joke. And if the answer is no, then they explain how they came up with that joke. And so it's mostly we're talking about how you come up with a joke in that concept.
Yeah.
And then since then, because I lost my job, I was like, right, I'm doing this podcasting thing and it's going well. So I decided to start my own company. And over the last few years of the pandemic, obviously that's just been a massive challenge, huge ups and downs. But finally coming out of it now, and things are really starting to pick up. So to go back to your question, what's my normal day like? So I work from home most of the time. Like, this is my podcast setup I'm talking to you on right now. So working on the website, making podcasts for clients, lots of podcast editing. I still teach a little bit as well. So I do some English teaching. Then in the evening, I do a comedy show every Thursday night. I do a quiz night every Tuesday night. So typical day is just busy. Like I really just don't stop. But I wouldn't have it any other way. And
Yeah.
that's something about Saigon that we love, and a lot of expats here. It's one of the things that keeps you here. It's partly to do with the weather, and it's partly to do with the culture here. It's so energetic. So I feel anyway, and most people I speak to, you just have energy all the time. Like, I wake up at 6 a.m. actually and go to the gym at 6:30
Mhm, mhm.
because it's daylight and it's already warm. So it's easy to
Yeah,
wake up and get your day going. But when I think
yeah.
back to living in New Zealand or Scotland or anywhere, even America in the winter, when you wake up at 6 o'clock and it's pitch black out, there's no way you're getting out of bed that easy. It's so difficult.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
here it gets dark about 6 o'clock, but then it's still warm. So it doesn't get cold. Like, it doesn't get dark and then gets cold. So it's still warm. So you're still out in your shorts and t-shirt. Life here is just the traffic, the energy. There's just this speak to anyone who lives in Saigon and they'll tell you about the crazy energy here.
And with that energy, do you think you would have ever, say, the comedic stuff? Do you think you ever would have came to that conclusion being in the UK? Living in Scotland, would that have ever cropped up in your mind?
Maybe not. It's hard to say, but yeah, maybe
Yeah.
not. One of the benefits here was the the expat community, which people think expats just means like Americans, Australians, and Scottish, or the UK, but it means like Indian, Japanese, Korean, every nationality you can think is here. So it's European as well. It's a French as well. So it's a big
Mhm,
big
mhm.
population. But there's only about 100,000 expats here, depending on what numbers you read. So it's quite a small community. So when you have like a stand up comedy night, I know for a fact, like in America or other places around the world, there might be 5 open mics on in one night, whereas here
Yeah.
we have 4 a week, and that's only just
Right.
new. There used to only be 1 a week, so the
Mhm, mhm,
scene's quite small. So to answer your question, yeah, I think the reason I did it here was mostly because it's so new and fresh, and it's
mhm.
it's easy to get into. Whereas if it was maybe I was in the UK and it was all well established, I'd probably get a bit scared and overwhelmed and intimidated, and probably not do it.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. But as for comedy there, like, how does that translate? I mean, like, okay, you're from Scotland, but I guess obviously you've
Mm.
lived in all these different places. How does it translate to being a comedian there?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, most of the kind of stuff I talk about is, being a Scotsman living in Vietnam. So it's the kind of crazy
Mhm.
things that you see, and then making it a funny joke or turning it around, making it funny. The biggest thing is you always want to make sure that I try anyway to make my jokes. I try not to make any of my jokes offensive. I'm not one of these
Mhm.
offensive comedians. I don't want to wind people up. I just want to make people laugh. So if I'm going to talk about Vietnam, you're not going to make fun of the people or criticize the people.
Mhm.
I'm just kind of going to make fun of like what I see, or my reaction to it, or something like that. Like, just for example, I had my phone stolen and I went to go and try and report it to the police station, and they wouldn't let me in because I had shorts on. Because in Vietnam, you're not allowed to go into a government building with shorts on because it's a sign of disrespect.
Right. Uh-huh.
And so, I mean, that's just batshit insane, right? It's just crazy. So I couldn't go in and report a crime. So I tell the story on stage, but the joke is, imagine if I went into Scotland with a knife coming out my side, blood dripping down me, and I tried to report a crime, and the officer turned me away and said, "I'll go home, put some trousers on, son. Come back when
Yeah.
you've cleaned yourself up." And see that, so that's what gets the laugh,
Yeah.
right? So you're kind of turning
Yeah.
it back on yourself rather than. So most of the audience is expat, like people from overseas, but you're probably about 20% are Vietnamese. Vietnam is just a booming economy. The young people here are more and more globalized through obviously the internet. So they get the jokes, they come and laugh. And then during the pandemic, they previously used to be a bunch of like amazingly funny Vietnamese comedians who would come and perform stand up in English, and they were hilarious. And just before the pandemic, or as the pandemic started, they started their own comedy group called Saigon Teo,
Mhm.
which they were. I'm going out on a limb here, but I think they're pretty much the first stand-up comedians in Vietnam to do comedy in Vietnamese. And what I'd been told from other Vietnamese comedians is it's really difficult to do because with stand-up comedy, it's all based on like nuances or double entendres or your tone of voice and things like this, or sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Are common kind of
Yeah.
well, sex and drugs are common kind of
Mhm.
topics, but these topics can't be discussed here in Vietnam. And the language itself doesn't lend itself to double entendre or tone of voice. Because if you change the tone with a word, it's not changing just how the word's perceived, it's changing the meaning of the word completely. So then it makes it nonsensical. So traditionally, comedy in Vietnam was very like slapstick, or like a guy dressing up as a woman was just the funniest thing ever.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
quite basic. But
Yeah.
these guys have basically revolutionized it and been able to do comedy in Vietnamese. And I was talking to someone recently. I was like, "What do they talk about?" And it's just like any day, any comedian just talking about everyday stuff, but
Mhm.
making it funny. So that's been really impressive to see that.
Well, it's been such an interesting story. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing it. Give us your website then, where people can kind of catch up with all your stuff.
Yeah, so if you go to 7millionbikes.com, so it's SEVEN million, and then bikes, which is BIKES. Now, because I make podcasts, anytime they transcribe my voice, because I'm Scottish, they transcribe that as bakes,
Yeah.
BAKES,
Yeah.
BIK. So 7millionbikes.com. And then you'll find all the clients I work with, the work I do. So I offer now like podcast consulting, I do editing and producing. And then right now, the
Mhm.
main thing I'm doing is a podcast course. So if any of your listeners are interested in learning how to make a podcast, you can go on to my website, and I have an online course where you can find out everything from like A to Z, how you start and make a podcast, all the software you need, the equipment. And I've
Mhm.
had a few people complete that course already and go out and start their own podcast. One of them's already in the top 5% of podcasts in the world, which like blew my mind. Her first episode like blew up, and it's been going great since then. So now my main mission is to help other people podcast, because without hyperbole, like starting a podcast changed my life.
Because it is such a creative outlet. Even if you're not doing it for the figures, you're not doing it for the money. It's just to have that outlet to do something.
Mm. Yeah, that's exactly it. The skills you learn, the people you meet, the things you get to do, like it's yeah, it really has changed my life. If I can't, I think of where my life is at now. If I hadn't started a podcast, I'd be living a pretty boring life, I think. So like
Hmm.
comedy, I've even done a commercial here, which was nothing really to do with podcasting, but just having the confidence to go and do that kind of stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and then working with clients around the world is it's just pretty incredible. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
anyone wants to
amazing.
start a podcast, do it.
Amazing. Well, I will put that link in the description as well. And yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Been absolutely brilliant.
No worries. Thanks for having me, and good luck with the future of your show.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. Thanks so much to Neil as well. And don't forget, if you do like the podcast, please hit that subscribe button and give a little rating and review as well. All the links are in the description. Until next time.